So I'm Claire Penketh. I'm Head of Disability Studies at Liverpool Hope University, which is an absolute privilege. It's fantastic to be able to work with such a fabulous team of scholars and academics who are working across a range of different areas in disability studies. I've got the absolute pleasure of hosting and just chairing this part, which is a real celebration, and how fantastic to have two of our colleagues who are launching books this afternoon. So as I say, it's an absolute pleasure. So thanks to Professor Bolt for the invitation to chair this session. A very brief introduction, but one thing that I just wanted to acknowledge is the interdisciplinarity, so this idea of working across disciplines. And the team in disability studies here represents a really wide range of different approaches that we bring to disability studies. And that's also reflected in the CCDS conference, Disability and Disciplines, that David referred to earlier. I'm also very, very happy that we've got people who are returning here, people who are not directly related to the teaching team in disability studies, but a range of colleagues from across the university and beyond. And it was great to hear that colleagues that, who've come and attended CCDS events in the past have also been able to come back here. And again, I know that David had given a particular mention to the MA students who are here as well. And I know that we've got new prospective students who are going to be starting with us in October, I should say. So it's fantastic to welcome you as well. So just a mention about our research in disability studies across the team is all aligned with the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies. And the two colleagues who are going to be presenting the work today really evidence a lot of the quality of the work that's happening across the department. We are really very, very lucky to have the degrees of mentorship that CCDS affords us, and again, David's leadership in that respect. So the first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Dr. Cheyne. She's Senior Lecturer in Disability Studies, and she's authored a number of works in literary and cultural disability studies, including co-editing work in the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies related to representations of disability in science fiction. The publication that she's launching today, I know you can. I just love the absolute sense of celebration that Ria brings to this. And I don't want to just make this a cosmetic exercise, but literally she has got a mug with the cover design of a book. She's dressed in the cover design of her book, and she's got a beautiful poster in her room. Those of you who, if you've not yet engaged with Ria's work, just an initial look at the introductory pages of that work will show you there's an absolute treat to engage with there. She will talk a little bit more about that work being open access. I think we'd already discussed that Ria's going to refer to that, but I would really recommend that as a key text for a number of you to engage with, but particularly for our MA students who are here. I'm going to move aside now. Ria, you've got up to half an hour. We will take questions at the end, and I'm just going to hand straight over. So can we just have a round of applause as Ria sorts the slides out?
Thank you, Claire. Just getting familiar with the setup here. Right. It's really great to be here today to kind of celebrate the launch of the book, but also to be back in person. I think we've all missed the in-person CCDS events over the last couple of years. And it's also really nice to reconnect with some people and to meet some new people I've not met before. Okay, so I'm going to start then with the obligatory plug for my book, okay? Partly because I should have had lots of lovely and they're beautifully designed flyers that Liverpool University Press sent me. Sorry, they've sent me, but which have been lost in the Royal Mail postal system. So instead we have scruffy ones where I've kind of scored out the old price and stuck on a sticker with the new price, etc., etc. So they're on the table over there. Feel free to have a look. So my book was released in December 2019, a while ago now. We were meant to be doing this in summer 2020 was the original plan, but you know, best laid plans and all that. So it's great to be here now. Right, so just one thing to flag up, that if you would like to buy my book, and no pressure, no, absolutely, it's normally $22.50, and it is now for the bargain price of $11.50, $11.25. Anyway, there's a discount code if you want to buy the actual hard copy. Or you can not buy my book, which is also a valid choice, particularly because it is available open access, okay? So via the Liverpool University Press webpage or on Open, and that's thanks to an initiative called Knowledge Unlatched, an Open Access Publishing Initiative. And I'd be very happy to talk a bit more about how my book came to be published open access. It was something that I wanted, but didn't think would ever be possible for me. So I'd be really happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. So my book's been out for a while. Some of you here, I know, have read it. I also kind of feel like it's been quite a long term. It's been a long academic year. We're all tired. I didn't think this was the space to get into some like detailed textual analysis of stuff that you might not have read or so on. So what I thought we'd do is talk briefly about what the book is about, and some of the reasons behind why I approached it the way I did, and give a snapshot of some key ideas. So there's a couple of kind of themes, concepts that I developed in the book for specific purposes, but feel like they could be taken further. So I'll be talking a little bit about those concepts and how I hope they might be taken further in the future. Okay. Right. So, the book then, Disability Literature Genre, Representation and Effect in Contemporary Fiction. As a senior scholar who I met at a conference said to me, you really got all your keywords in there, didn't you? So I don't want to miss a search, right? So basically, yeah, that is what it's about. Brings together cultural disability studies, affect theory, literary studies, bit of medical humanities, some genre theory as well, okay? It is a short book, but a big book, if that makes sense. So you can see that I'm bridging across a number of areas. It's very multidisciplinary. So the total length was under 85,000 words, but despite that, it still got double weighted in the university's ref submission, okay? So that is possible. So it examines the intersection of disability and genre in works of contemporary horror, crime, science fiction, fantasy and romance, novels, literature, published from the late 1960s onwards. Okay, I've put the chapter titles on there because they signal some of the people, I think, at least if you're involved in cultural disability studies, they signal some of the people whose work I draw on. So you'll see the notion of body minds there in the horror chapter, so thinking about Margaret Price's work. Desirable futures in the romance chapter, that's picking up on Alison Kafer's work about futures in relation to disability. There are various blurbs, okay, that the publishers have put on. I've got some of them coming up later in the slide. Just for future reference for anyone who's not gone through this process, when you see the bit of the back of the book that, saying that this is offers a transformative perspective on blah, 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 or as an essential reading for blah, 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 the authors of the book write those, okay? So that was me who said those things, not ones with other people's name on it, but yeah. So if you ever have to write one of those yourself, like, don't hold back. I thought there would be a marketing team or something, and then I got the book and I was like, oh no, it's me. I'm glad I kind of talked myself up a bit. Anyway, so my book then had 3 key aims, So the first one, to demonstrate a disability-informed approach to offer new and transformative insights into the workings of genre fiction, I suppose, particularly, to examine genre fiction as a key site of investigation for cultural disability studies, to demonstrate the value of an effective approach to both disability and genre, and effective, with an A there, I mean an approach that is really engaging with or focusing on affect and emotion, okay? And being an academic, there are lots of puns around the book about affect and effect because, you know, why would you be an academic if you can't do those sorts of things? Okay. So, it was quite a long and winding road to this book coming out. In the next photo, I'm taking you back to the long ago days of 2007, okay? Over at the far right of that picture is me. Those are all the people graduating with a PhD in English literature that day from Royal Holloway, University of London, which is where I got my PhD. I'm quite nostalgic looking at that picture. It feels like a very long time ago now. So I'd done a PhD in English literature on language and linguistics in science fiction. I'd used a little bit of disability theory in it in one of the last chapters I wrote to explore sort of alien bodies and languages. And I was also working as a disability support worker. Like, that was the way I supported myself financially during my PhD. I was a support worker in universities for disabled students. I did note-taking, mentoring, things like that. So as you finish your PhD, I was precariously employed, underemployed, precariously employed, as many people are early in their careers. The majority of people are early in their careers. And I thought, I really like this stuff on disability and science fiction. I think I'd like to write an article on that. And I found out about the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. And I remember sending an email to David Bolt because I thought, I don't know if they'd be interested in this. No one was working on disability and genre fiction at that time. The whole kind of field itself was still emerging. I sent an email to David Bolt saying, hey, this is me, I'm interested in writing on this. And he kind of responded very positively and stayed in touch with him beyond that. So, yeah. At that time as well, there's very much a mould if you're graduating with an English literature PhD that, to have any hope of getting a job, you've got to have a book published. That's the thing. And I was absolutely sick to death of my PhD, and I think me and my PhD examiners both agreed that my PhD probably should not be a book. We'd got a couple of good articles out of it, but let's let it go there. It was quite, I think, a bit too narrowly focused. So I had this idea that I would do a book on disability and genre fiction. And I talked about this with my PhD supervisor, who was, quite supportive, but also pointed out that really I only actually knew about 2 genres, and that probably there was quite a lot you'd have to read and learn about the others. So I'd been working on science fiction and fantasy, didn't really know a whole lot about the other popular genres. And yes, he was absolutely right. I do not recommend trying to write a book project that spans kind of 5 genres for a postdoctoral project, or indeed ever, probably. There's a reason that people don't do that. But also being who I am, the moment someone says you can't do something or that it's not a good idea to do something, nothing makes me want to do it more. So my course was set from that moment, okay? So that was my project. Now, you'll notice that if I started working on this in 2007 and it was published in 2019, that's quite a substantial span of time in between there, okay? So there's various things happened. I was precariously employed. I moved to Liverpool, and I ended up getting a 1-year position in the disability studies team here at Hope. That was 2009. I met Stuart Murray at the University of Leeds while I was kind of getting to know people working on disability and literature in the local area, and he encouraged me to submit my book proposal for a series he just started editing then with Liverpool University Press, and his own book was just about to come out with it at that time, representing autism, a really, I think, really significant and foundational book in cultural disability studies. So I struggled a lot with this book and kind of talk through this just to, I think we see a lot about the successes and the celebrations, and it's really great to have that, but just if anyone feels like they are struggling with their own research or struggling to get a book, a book, that's a really big thing, to get that completed, perhaps this will give you some encouragement that, it is possible and that you're not the only one who's been there. So I really struggled kind of to get the book finished. I was I forced it out. I worked all hours while I was starting a new full-time job. I was just tired. My mental health wasn't great. So I wrote the book and I submitted it in 2014. And the press sent it to the reviewers and they came back. They'd already offered me a kind of advanced contract based on my proposal. And they came back and were like, this is not very good. No. And they were right. They were absolutely right. I think the fact that I hadn't been in a great headspace did really show in what I'd produced. And it had been a struggle, and that was there on the pages. And I was, quite upset by this, even though I knew in my heart that it was fair. So I kind of went away, had a bit of a depressive funk for a few months, and then came back to it. And then there was a sort of click moment where I was like, oh, what if I added in this idea of affect and emotion? Because that wasn't there in the first proposal for the book at all. It was just representation in contemporary fiction. So I had this sort of click. I put in a proposal for how I proposed to rework it, and they said, yep, sounds good. Started working away. I was almost done with my revisions to the new version, when I went into labour with my older boy in 2017, and I remain convinced that had he only had the decency to be say 7 days late instead of 2 days early, that I would have had the book finished and published in early 2018. So not my fault, absolutely. So that obviously, you can't do a great deal of writing with a newborn. So I ended up going back to it, finally got it revised and finished in May 2019. And eventually it was, they really didn't want only the most tiny minor changes. And it came out late in 2019. Okay, so a kind of long road. Now, this was bad because obviously it's not good for your career to be working on a book for 12 years, especially when you keep promising that it'll be done in your annual reviews every year and so on, and then have to write and go, oh, right, it's not done yet, sorry. It was also bad because other new stuff was being published. So all these great, clear statements I've made about how no one is writing about disability in genre fiction and there is no work on this. And I am the first person to come up with the idea, kept on having to be rewriting it and changed into footnotes with early work on this has been done by blah, 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 and blah, as everyone kind of lapped me. The good thing, I suppose, was that I've had a very long time to think about these issues. And also just to read a lot. This was a project that really involved a lot of kind of volume of reading. Even leaving aside the critical stuff, I've got an annotated bibliography at the back of the book that has information on over 250 primary texts. So I read all of those. I read a whole bunch more as well. Those were the only ones I could remember at the end. And all the critical work. And all of these fields, so romance, science fiction, fantasy, horror, crime, they all have their own bodies of critical work as well. So it was absolutely a massive amount of reading, and doing it over a long time meant that I could actually do that. Okay. So that's a bit about the story of the kind of long and winding road to the book coming out. So what does the book actually do then? So I said that it had 3 key aims around genre and disability. So the first 2 of those were to demonstrate that a disability-informed approach can offer new and transformative insights into the workings of genre, to establish genre fiction as a key site of investigation for disability studies. So as I say, when I started working on this project, there was very little work on disability in genre fiction. Now, more recently, there have been some well, there's been quite a lot of works, but there's also been monograph length works published. So particularly Susanna B. Mintz's book on disabled detectives in 2018, Sammy Shock's book on Black women's speculative fiction. Sorry, hers is 2018, Susanna Mintz's book was 2019. It came out about the same time as mine. There's been lots more shorter stuff published, but when I started, there was really almost nothing. And I think this was partly because, you know, cultural disability studies, as I understand it, really emerges off the back of 3 key works published in the mid to late 1990s. So Davis's Enforcing Normalcy, Rosemary Garland Thompson's Extraordinary Bodies, and Mitchell and Snyder's Narrative Prosthesis. And so I think the earliest of those is Enforcing Normalcy in 1995. So it's still quite a new field, okay, in the mid-late 2000s when I'm working on this. And one of the things that you're doing when you're trying to establish a new field, people tend to start with the safer bets. If you're worried that your approach to, that your focus on disability in the context of literary studies is going to be dismissed as frivolous or not worthy or kind of a niche interest, you don't help yourself by looking at disability in science fiction, say, or romance novels, which another group of people, quite often the same group of people, will dismiss as being frivolous or unworthy of study or a minority interest, right? So you'll see a lot of the earlier work is quite focused on canonical texts, the things that are accepted widely as having literary value. Please imagine the quotation marks around that phrase. You know, there's more mileage in doing something on Shakespeare than science fiction if you're trying to get your new approach recognised and valued in the field. And I also think literary studies is still quite a conservative field as well in a lot of ways. So there wasn't much work for, you know, quite for understandable reasons. Or, and this was the thing that kind of got my goat more, was that where some of the key works did discuss genre fiction texts, they discussed them without sort of acknowledging they were genre fiction texts. And kind of, you know, the example I always think of is Leonard Davis, whose work I think is fantastic. But in the opening chapter of Enforcing Normalcy, he talks for quite a while about a, you know, relatively obscure science fiction short story called The Persistence of Vision by a guy called John Varley. Now, it is a science fiction short story, absolutely. It's also, it was published in a science fiction magazine. It's essentially a rewriting of an earlier science fiction story, H.G. Wells's The Country of the Blind. So, like, I don't really have issues with his reading of it, but like the phrase science fiction's not even mentioned. And like, to me, there's that whole bit of the discussion that's relevant that's missing there. So I really wanted to make sure that that was going back in, okay? So I think genre really matters for how disability is represented, and I don't think you can discuss disability and engage with disability representation in its full complexity if you don't actually acknowledge or consider how genre might factor in to how something's depicted or represented. The other thing that we saw in the critical work at that time, and you know, I think still through today, is we saw an avoidance of particular genres. So even once some work on disability and genre fiction started to come through, we saw some genres like horror, for example, very much dismissed or avoided, okay? Now, my colleague David Bolt has written really usefully about what he calls critical avoidance, where people avoid engaging with disability out of a whole bunch of things, but you know, I think largely, and David, I'm oversimplifying here, but coming down to ableism really, is that fair to say? That's a key part of it? Yeah, right. But there's also, I think, we have avoidance within disability studies of certain types of writing or certain genres, okay? So in particular, horror was seen as a really kind of unpromising or unproductive place for disability studies, that really all it could be would be kind of a repository of negative or problematic representations. What we also had in the critical work, and again, this is to do with how the field is developing, there's a tendency to generalise about genre, to generalise about disability representation. And again, this is to do with how fields or subfields emerge and develop. When you're starting out, you know, in fields, what people tend to do is do stuff that's broader, that kind of is wider in scope, and then specific areas are investigated on the back of that once the foundational work has laid. So what you see in cultural disability studies is you see in the earlier work a lot of attempts to talk about disability in literature and make more sort of general universalizing pronouncements. And then later on you get a move to, for example, impairment-specific studies like Murray's Representing Autism, or other works in that vein, or David Bolt's meta-narrative of blindness. You get moves to focus on disability in particular, fiction from particular time periods or from particular locations, okay? But that comes after the more general foundational stuff has been done. So what we had, as Claire Barker said, was that we had a tendency to universalise. Regardless of genre, period and context of production, or political orientation, literature is understood to follow prescribed patterns of disability representation. In other words, you know, people weren't really thinking about genre as a factor. And the other thing is that, you know, a lot of my experience reading that work on disability in literature as someone who'd come from a genre fiction background who was very much steeped in that, was I would read that and go, yeah, but that's not true in science fiction. Or I'd read something else and be like, well, but this thing that happens in crime fiction problematizes that a bit. It's a yes, but reaction. And I think in a way this whole book is a product of yes, but. Have you thought about how genre plays into how disability might be represented? Okay. So one of my, and I still can't decide whether it's an argument I make in the book or just an assumption I start off with, is that genre really matters for disability representation. Genre context shapes and inflects disability representation in ways that I think before the book hadn't really been examined, okay? Influencing how and when disability is invoked or depicted, okay? I think there's also, I had a sense that genre fiction could really add something to disability studies, cultural disability studies, but disability studies more broadly. You know, genre fiction is, generally, it's popular. Certainly the stuff I was looking at was all popular. It's the stuff that people read for pleasure, that they read out of their own choice. It's not things you're forced to read in a classroom, okay? And that's really significant if we're thinking about, well, what is having the biggest influence on how people think about disability? And I also believe that you can find really challenging and thought-provoking representations in genre fiction. Okay. Claire, I'm going to need the full half hour, I think. Is that okay? Cool. Okay, the third aspect of it then was around affect and emotion. I'm not going to go into definitions of affect here because there are just as many definitions of affect in affect studies as there are people working in affect studies, I think. Basically, I'm meaning kind of emotion plus, okay? I'm talking about feelings, but also with a sense that they might be embodied, visceral in some ways rather than kind of intellectual constructs, okay? So one of the things I was trying to do in the book is to demonstrate that actually thinking about feelings, thinking about emotions can really deepen our understanding of disability and its representation and of genre fiction, okay? So none of this, as I said, was in the first draft of the book. There wasn't much work on disability and emotion in general. Actually, this is something that's really changed in the last 3 years, and I think there's lots and lots of work coming through now, which is great. There's a 2011 special issue of the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies on emotion that was really valuable. But there wasn't that much work on disability and emotion. And the work that did exist was quite fixed in a sort of divide between, you had your good emotions, your good affects, so pride, anger, sense of community or solidarity. These were legitimate feelings in relation to disability, whether that was in context of personal experience or scholarly engagement. But feelings like pity, fear, shame, distrust, those were kind of perceived as illegitimate, and the only really acceptable way to engage with them was in the form of critique, for example, of media images that use disability to evoke those emotions, or in personal narratives of your own feelings before you, say, discovered disability activism in the disability community. So it wasn't that the field wasn't considering affect and emotion, but that the engagement with it had been channeled in some kind of quite limiting ways, I thought. And it seemed to me, and still seems to me now, that much of the most interesting work in disability studies is about putting those emotions and putting those personal experiences back in and insisting upon their importance, okay? So that ended up being the first line of the book. Disability makes us feel. That's my starting point. And what follows from that is that all of our encounters with disability are affective or emotive encounters. And I also used affect and emotion to offer a new approach to genre definition, a new sort of reconceptualization of genre reading, which I'll pass over that for now. But ultimately, my argument was that by looking at the sort of emotive representations in genre fiction, helps us to understand the emotions that are often attached to disability and their significance. Okay? So I'll briefly mention just two concepts or ideas that I put forward in the book that I did just a little bit with, but I think they've got more to them. I think they could be taken further. So one of them, I'm not really thinking about disability in terms of definitions. I do put in a definition, you have to in a book. I say that it's a complex attribute arising from the intersection of body minds with a natural or built environment, social expectations, systemic barriers, and cultural norms. I think that's quite succinctly put, but I'm not doing anything different there from other people in cultural disability studies, okay? What I'm more interested in the book, what I think is a more flexible model, is to think about disability encounters, okay? Because that way you don't need to draw a firm line between disabled and non-disabled people. You don't need to make a distinction between disability and impairment. You don't need to be thinking about who identifies as disabled and who doesn't. So encounters, I think, is a more flexible model, and I define them as moments when disability is claimed, embodied, disavowed, or rendered perceptible or imperceptible. And I suggest in the book that you could sort of broadly divide them up into three categories: interpersonal ones, just what you'd think, an encounter with another person to whose body-mind disability adheres. So an encounter in which one or both sides perceive disability as present. And a kind of paradigmatic one, the one that's had the most attention in the scholarly work, would be the non-disabled encounter with a disabled person, yeah? But it might be encounters between multiple disabled people. It might encompass moments of solidarity between disabled people. It might involve discomforting encounters between non-disabled and disabled people. But anyway, it encompasses a whole range of encounters. Individual or personal disability encounters involve an encounter of disability as it adheres to your own body-mind. Might be including pain, fatigue, mental states that have been coded as abnormal. Might include situations where a disabled person confronts structural barriers or a lack of access. But they might also include moments or encounters that are pleasurable as well, okay? Sense of pride, of community identity, okay? And the final one, representational encounters, which is the focus of the book, encounters, readers or viewers' encounters with disability as they read, view, listen, game. Might include in times when disability metaphors are evoked or disablest language used. Now, texts, of course, can depict all kinds of disability encounters within them, and disability studies scholars have long observed that encounters with fictional disabled characters can influence attitudes and behaviours in real-world encounters with disabled people. So I mention this because I think actually, you could do more with this. You know, I just, like, literally what you've got there is all that's in the book, okay? But, like, what about other types of disability encounter and the emotions they might involve? What about, say, the bureaucratic disability encounter, the educational disability encounter? What might be the expectations for those sorts of genres? What might be the feelings and emotions we expect to feel in those kinds of encounters? I think there's a lot you could do with that. And finally, the last thing, I suggested that each of the genres I examine has characteristic disability icons, recurring figures which have a particular effective emotive resonance or charge in that genre context. So, for example, in horror, the deformed monster, the psychotic villain, the vulnerable blind heroine, okay? We see these in films, we see them in literature. Romance, the wounded hero, the needy disabled child, okay? They appear in other kinds of narratives, these figures, but in their specific genres where they are iconic, they have this particular emotive charge. They are embedded with and embody familiar narratives or tropes. They are effective nodes, I suggest. And they're not static. New icons may emerge while others lose iconic status. So, for example, in crime fiction, the exceptionally minded detective is a long-standing iconic figure. But more recently, we've seen a specific variant emerge, the neurodivergent detective, whose unique insights and quirky way of working is what solves the crime. Again, this is something I mentioned glancingly, but I think there's more scope to develop this and do it further. Right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Yeah, it is. It was clear, which is what matters. Thank you, folks.
Thank you so much. It was excellent to have that nicely extended discussion of your work, Ria, and I can completely recommend that work. Super. We're going to move on to our second book that we're going to launch this afternoon. Bye, Mark. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Erin Pritchard. She's a lecturer in disability studies. I don't know why I keep looking at my book, as if I work with her every day. I still have to look down. She's a lecturer in disability studies. And anybody, a number of people who've already referenced that they're quite scared of Erin. Erin is, I was referring to the MA students there. Erin's work is informed by her activism as well as her research, particularly on the areas around dwarfism. And again, she has co-edited an edition of the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies on representations of dwarfism. She will speak about her work much more forcefully and more convincingly than I ever will. So I'm going to just introduce Erin and let her get set up now. Can we just welcome Erin?
My book, Dwarfism, Spatiality and Disabling Experiences, is based on my doctoral research, which I completed at Newcastle University in 2014. It was an ESLC funded project and it was in human geography. So I have this background in geography. I'd never really thought about disability studies before because I started off as a physical geographer. So I was more into looking at rocks and stuff. But when I then went on to do human geography, basically because it was inaccessible, because a lot of people, a lot of disabled staff students here would recognise when you go to university, they make all these false promises. Yeah, it'll be fine, it'll be accessible, it'll be great. It wasn't. So I went to human geography, and then I actually came about like disability studies as a mistake. I was like, one of a colleague who was an MA student when we were in a pub, asked me, so, you know, how do you do shopping and stuff? And I said, well, it's a bit of a problem, you know, and I started moaning and, you know, trolleys are inaccessible, this is inaccessible. And he goes, well, why don't you do your dissertation on that? And I thought, oh, good, got that cleared now. But then when I went and spoke to my, personal tutor, he says, no, Erin, that's your PhD project. So that's what I went ahead and did. So I got into sort of geographies of disability. And I was like, they have that? Okay. So that's what I went and did. So the blurb, the book, revolves around this dwarfism's most prominent feature, which is body size, but also shape. So I'll come on to that in a minute when I speak about dwarfism. So it's not just that they're short stature. Okay, and it contributes to both social geography and disability studies, showing how a bodily difference, which is predominantly about height, is disabled by a one-size-fits-all society. So I think that's really important because when we think about disability, we don't think about height. We think about people with functional limitations usually, whether that's a physical impairment such as like, you know, not being able to walk or having, you know, mobility difficulties. It's not about height, you're just small, you know, that's it. Yeah, if we think about some of the adjustments we make for disabled people, it's about lowering things. But we don't lower them for dwarfs because they're just small. And it's like, well, how am I meant to, like, you know, interact with these things? Do I stretch or something? Or, you know, it must be magic. So I thought this is what it's important to bring that into disability studies. So as disability can be understood as a social construct, applying a geographical perspective, in this sense a spatial theory, can aid in further understanding how the built environment is disabling for people with dwarfism. And so the book aims to create this broader understanding of the social and spatial, so the spatial is the physical aspects, experiences of people with dwarfism, whilst attempting to respond to some of the misconceptions about dwarfism, including its contention as a disability and often seen as a figure in entertainment. So with dwarfism, most people know of dwarfism. They've seen dwarfs, they've seen them in the telly, you know, they've seen them in films. You know, some people I've met have said, oh yeah, my friend hired one out for a wedding. So people are very aware that there's these figures of entertainment, but they've never really met a dwarf personally. They don't know anymore. So there's lots of misconceptions because there's a lot of limited research on dwarfism. Prior to this PhD, there was lots of, like, you know, medical aspects of dwarfism, especially with children with dwarfism. And then when you sort of get to the age of 18, you've forgotten about, because maybe, I don't know, according to these, you know, conservative government, all our disabilities disappear when we turn 18. It still hasn't happened, but it will. So that was that. Okay. So dwarfism, it results in a person being no taller than 4'10" and having a medical condition. So I think that's really important because a lot of people say, "Are you just small?" Oh, I'm short too, so I know what it's like to be like you. And I won't say anything because, you know, it's a bit rude. But it's like, oh, so the first thing I'll say to them is, okay, so how much did you pay for the pedal extensions on your car? And they'll go, well, didn't. And do you work in Panther? No, well, nor do I. So, you know, and it's that medical condition as well is important to put in there. You know, people think, again, you're just short. But there is this underlying medical condition with dwarfism, which is usually genetic. But when I say genetic, it doesn't mean like you're born to a family of dwarfs. Again, that's something I get asked, is like, well, you know, are you family? Are you and I'm like, they're Welsh. No, but are they short? No, they're not, okay? I had a short auntie, but that was it. But, you know, 80% of people with dwarfism are born to average-sized parents, so we don't live in a separate race in a forest or anything like that. Although I do come from Wales, so it's close enough, right? But there are over 400 different types of dwarfism, that even shocks me. With underlying impairments that often differ. So depending on the type of dwarfism, a person has either disproportionate or proportionate body size. So the most common form of dwarfism is achondroplasia, and 80% of people with that condition are born to average-sized parents. I have achondroplasia, so basically what it means is my torso is sort of average height or stature, but then my arms and legs are shorter. Okay, and that's really important to understand because it impacts your sort of reach, stuff like that. But also these underlying medical conditions, so spinal stenosis is a common one. It's one basically where your spine's really narrow and bent, and it's really like, you know, if you bought a spine from the pound shop, it's just broken, there's no point in it really, you know, it serves a function, but you get asked for your money back. So basically that causes mobility difficulties and everything. But again, in the media, we're just short. So just thinking about that, okay. So that's my book. So that's the cover of the book. So it's just one of those plain Routledge covers. I sort of chose sort of like an urban design for it. So it's just a white sort of architectural thing. So I'm not really good on image descriptions, am I? So that's the book. It explores the spatial barriers people with dwarfism experience in public spaces and forms of resistance. So how do they resist these public barriers? How do they resist, physical spaces? Because like everyone else, they've got to interact with these spaces daily to live, whether it's to go shopping, to go to appointments, to post a letter, to do whatever. So you've got to often show forms of resistance because there's no other way around it. Okay? So my form of resistance here is having my lovely assistant Kay, who I borrowed off David. Oh, you're going red. And then focus on their identity as disabled people and how this impacts their access to spaces, including accessible spaces. So as a lot of people know, if you've got an invisible impairment, you get told off for using an accessible car park or accessible toilet. Well, people with dwarfism, it's blatantly obvious that you need to use a low counter, but they still get told off. And it's like, when that's in a bank, you're like, I'm not trusting you and my money. But yeah. And then examine how, if they navigate spaces differently, both due to social and spatial barriers. So when people want to go out in society, you want to go to the town, you'll take the first route, you go this way, you go that way. People with dwarfism navigate it differently. Whether that's because, well, I can't get into the building that way because the door handle's too high, or I'm not going past there because there's a school and all the kids will start mocking. Or I'm not going past there because there's a middle-aged man that acts like a kid and he'll just mock us. So you find different ways of navigating spaces, and that's a bit of the geography part coming out. And then the last part, which builds on that, is to uncover the impact of cultural representations of dwarfism and what it has on them in society. So whilst people say, oh, it's just a joke, if you don't like it, don't watch it, actually, there's a lot of people that don't know that, the difference between fiction and reality. So what they see on telly and how a dwarf behaves there, or in a film, or in their friend's wedding, is then how they treat a person with dwarfism in society. Yeah, thank you. So I use this theory of space, so Levy's theory of space, as a social product. So according to him, space can be conceived as a triad, which contains representations of space, representational space, and spatial practice in order to understand how spaces are socially produced. So he suggests that representations of spaces are conceived spaces designed by planners or architects, so they're basically designed for the average size, able-bodied person. Okay, and then with alternative spaces, again, those are designed with specific users in mind, so accessible spaces are usually designed with a typical wheelchair user in mind. And the ergonomics of that, so ergonomics is the sort of height, the size. Is that a bumblebee on me? So the representations of space influence the meaning and materiality. So the materiality of a space is associated with the physical structure, whilst the meaning is associated with how it's used and by whom. So, like a university, it's going to be used by students and academics and stuff, whereas a nightclub is going to be, used by, students again and young people, that kind of thing. So there's different meanings on how we behave in those spaces. So how a space is conceived by planners can impact the spatial practice of different users. The spatial practice relates to how people negotiate and use different spaces. So representational space relates to the meaning of that space to the user, which also in turn impacts how they engage with that, how their spatial practice, so who belongs in that space and how they use it. Okay, so the methodology. So I interviewed 22 people with dwarfism. They were mostly women and they were all living in the UK. If you want to know why it's mostly women, then there's a paper on that. So there was a mixture of face-to-face, telephone and email interviews because missed out, dwarfism is a really rare impairment, so there's people with dwarfism spread across the UK. So, one minute I was down in Kent, the next minute I had a participant up in North Lanarkshire, Scotland, so I was like, let's do a telephone interview, But they got to choose which one they wanted. I also incorporated photo elicitation exercises within the interviews. So this was great for knowing how they interact with different spaces, because if they showed them an image, like, for example, I showed them one of a shopping mall, and the physical space there and the people that were in those spaces, like one person said, oh, I won't walk past the early learning centre, there'll be kids in there, they'll all start pointing, I'm going to avoid that. There's old women there, talking, having a conversation. They won't be bad, but they'll stop the conversation and have a look, things like that. Oh, that bench is too high to get on. Those kind of things they'd notice. Then I also showed them maps of where they lived. There's, again, the geography part coming out. So they'd say, oh, I won't walk past that nightclub, no, no, no. Or I might walk past it during the day, but not during the night. Or that school there, no, I want to get to that place, I'm avoiding that school completely. So all these kind of ways that they navigate through a space, if they're walking, if they're, you know, different if they're in cars. So it's about how they use those spaces and how they're restricted on how they use those spaces. Yeah, so, thank you. This was, my own positionality was a basis for this research. So as I said before, you know, well, if you haven't noticed, I've got dwarfism. And this was based on some of my own experiences and, you know, how there was very limited and lots of misconceptions about dwarfism. Like people saying, you're not disabled. Even social workers saying, you're not disabled, but you should go to a special school. So it's about trying to challenge all those ideas or misconceptions and stupidity, basically. So the first chapter, I was looking at the physicality of the space, these spaces. So the general spaces that everybody uses, but also particular spaces, alternative spaces, and how they can be enabling or disabling. So explores how people negotiate spaces, including transport created for people of average stature. So the social impact. So as Michelle says here, and these are all pseudonyms, the counters are sometimes high, and sometimes when you're in a queue, the staff, they don't see you and instead serve the person behind you. And also the person behind you sees that as a great opportunity. The amount of times that someone with dwarfism will have someone reaching over their head to get something, or like putting their hand in front of your face to get served because, you know, you're not there. Or they want to see that you're not there because they're desperate for their donuts or whatever it is. The avoidance of spaces. So as Amanda says, if I know a place has a high counter or something and another one down the road does not, then I'll go to the other. So that's fine. Like you lot got, like most people have a choice, don't they? So say now they've got Costa Coffee and they've got a local cafe. They'll go, I'll go to the Costa because it's cheaper. No, I'll go to the local cafe because it's nicer. Whereas a person with dwarfism's got to go, oh, I really hate the coffee there. It tastes like crap, but that's the only one I can go to because that's the one that's accessible. So you're restricted. You don't have that choice of, I prefer there, you know? And so examining those alternative spaces and how they can be enabling or disabling because of their structure. So some people with dwarfism found that some spaces lowered for children, like some sinks and toilets and stuff are lowered for children. That's great, they can use them, but it can be infantilizing. Because a lot of accessible spaces, like, you know, accessible toilets and stuff, they're made for a typical wheelchair user, this very stereotypical disabled person. You know, look at all the stock images of disability, you know, Google images, newspaper articles. It's always an image of a wheelchair user. The international symbol of access, which you see on toilet doors and everything, is a wheelchair user. And yet less than 8% of disabled people use a wheelchair. But every stock image, if they're like, oh, well, talking about disability, bring out the wheelchair. So that creates this particular notion in the representations of space for planners, in that they conceive it as only a space being used for wheelchair users. So for people with dwarfism, the low sink, the low door lock is great, but then the higher toilet is really problematic. So all the counters can be quite far back. So, you know, you have to reach and you can't do it. So these can be very problematic. Okay. So these accessible spaces are based on typical notions, and as like Monica points out, apart from smaller counters and things, but even then, people in wheelchairs still have got the reach, or typical wheelchair user, as they have an average size arm length, whereas they don't think about it for us at all. And then, as Sophia points out, here in England, they only see disabled people as people in wheelchairs. I do feel we're excluded and not seen as important as others. But again, this comes back to this notion, you're just small. You're not a real disabled person. Okay, so resisting spaces. How do they resist them? Because half the time disabled spaces or accessible spaces aren't accessible, and then you're having to live in a built environment created for an average sized person. Okay, so focusing on how they interact with different spaces, and the hidden labour, which Jackie Scully coins, is that how you have to manage interactions and how you have to manage everything. So managing that unwanted attention, because as a dwarf you're already going to get stared at, but then if you're doing something differently, wow, that's like entertainment, you know? So it's dependent on others. So dependency is one thing, asking for help. But asking for help is not straightforward. So, like as Jade points out, places where they're very busy and they're not going to consider your needs, like on a Saturday, I wouldn't contemplate going shopping there. The shop assistants are too busy, so they can't assist you. And then interacting with facilities differently. So as Monica says, if you can't reach to put your PIN number in, like you can PIN facility, you have to get your purse out and tap it with your purse, or a ruler that you might have in your bag. I don't know who carries a ruler in the bag. Or a pen. Again, these are all things that make people look at you because you are doing it different from what somebody would normally do, so you're grabbing that attention. And, you know, like I said, as you know, Shakespeare, as Al pointed out, 98% of people with dwarfism experience being stared at. I don't know who that 2% are, but 98 get stared at when they're out. So then when you do something differently on top of that, the unwanted attention is going to increase because you're bringing that to yourself. So perceptions of disability. So it's seen as more of a difference and it's often contested as a disability. Lots of people, you know, especially tall people like to tell me I'm not disabled and like to tell lots of dwarfs are not disabled. And parents, who, you know, 80%, like I said, average size parents will say to their kid, you're not disabled, he can do everything that anybody else can. I'm like, oh yeah, can he reach that top shelf? No. Well, he's disabled then, isn't he? It's just seeing that positive representation of disability, but they play it down so much, you know? So, as Jade said, I had a wheelchair user tell me off once for using an accessible toilet because I wasn't in a wheelchair. I explained how I couldn't reach the sink, the lock, the dryer, or see the mirror in the, you know, the regular toilet. She still didn't think that they were also for us because that symbol, the ISA, the International Symbol of Access, says that it's specifically for them and them only. Okay, so that's really problematic. I mean, you know, you see signs for zoos and they've got elephants on them, but you know, you're expecting to see other animals there too, aren't you? But when they use a wheelchair or a mobility scooter, they receive less unwanted attention. So as Jade says, when I'm on a scooter, I'm treated differently. I'm a more accepted member of society than when I'm not using it. And this comes down to, well, you know, a wheelchair user is not a mythical creature. A wheelchair user is not a figure of fun. A wheelchair user is a disabled person, and they're short, you know, they're not short or disfigured as like a dwarf is. Now that's not to say that wheelchair users don't get unwanted attention, or they don't experience disability hate crimes or hate speech or anything like that. But as the next slide will show, they're not figures of entertainment, and this has a massive impact on how people with dwarfism are treated, creating this hierarchy of impairments in that you can't access disabled spaces and you're going to be treated a lot differently. So, like Lydia says, and Lydia worked with children or adults with cerebral palsy, it's okay to do dwarf throwing, but they wouldn't do wheelchair throwing or blind person throwing or cerebral palsy throwing. I've got a few friends who are disabled, and when I'm out and about with them, or if I observe them from a while ago, they're not singled out as much as somebody with dwarfism. You know, one of the things that we notice a lot of people with dwarfism, they just get photographed. You know, I've had people stopping in the cars to take photographs and stuff. I'm not a celebrity, and you can't confuse me with a celebrity. But that's what happens because, like, an experience I had was my sister-in-law used to work in Morrison Deli, and I'd been shopping, and her colleague ran up to her and was like, Marit, guess what? I've just seen a real-life midget. She was like, she's a dwarf, and that's, you know, Laura's sister. And it was like, oh, but she's cute. Like, I'm not cute. But this was the thing that I've seen a real-life midget, a real-life one. It's come to life. You know, it's jumped out the telly. It's there. It's jumped out of a fairy tale. And that's the way people perceive you. So it's such a novelty to see you. You know, and so like Lydia says, you don't do the sort of other disabled people tossing, and nor should you, but dwarf tossing, that's okay. Midget wrestling, that's okay, but try it with any other minority group, and it's going to be trouble, you know? So dwarfism is often deemed more of a novelty than a disability, okay? Not only prominent in films and television shows, but also a commodity that can be hired out. So in the 17th century, dwarfs were kept as pets or traded as gifts in European courts. So, you know, you were controlled by royalty, and Princess Eugenie, you know who her father is, don't you? A few years ago, hired out 7 dwarfs when she dressed up as Snow White. And you couldn't talk to the dwarfs, and she danced with the dwarfs. She practically owned them. So that's where your taxpayers' money's going. Okay, so that's how they're used. And still today, you've got companies, event agencies, where you can hire out dwarfs. And because they'll add a bit of magic and fun. They'll run around tables for you and act so inappropriately. So I got in touch with a few of these companies and just emailed them and said, do you hire out any other disabled people? And they never got back to me. I was like, oh, right, okay. So and they said it's not degrading, they enjoy it. Well, surely others would. So due to the rarity of dwarfism, but its prominence within the media, most people with dwarfism have experienced unwanted attention based on certain stereotypes. So as Mira points out here, everywhere I go, they say, that's a midget, or that's a mini-me, so Austin Powers. It's all those characters, and they're all quite funny characters. Now, one thing that every participant points out, some participants would say, I'm a little person, others a person with dwarfism, short stature, restricted growth. Every single participant hated the word midget because it's such an offensive term. It was used in the freak shows, and it's really, subhuman. It's really creates this inferior thing, and it's what most people with dwarfism, and not every person with dwarfism, will have experienced having screamed at them by someone or shouted. So, contrary to what middle-aged men on Twitter say, it's actually really offensive. So there's that show, Life's Too Short, with Warwick Davis. It's meant to show a dwarf's life, but he gets stuck in a toilet. How is that a dwarf's life? I've never known that to happen. It's just having fun made out of his height. And then, and the problem is with Warwick Davis, he's the patron of Little People UK, which is this charity for people with dwarfism that says we promote a positive representation. It's like, you're stuck in the toilet, mate. That's not a positive representation. And hence why dwarfs have not moved on. So, and the thing that gets me is that some small people like that guy, Bernie Troyer, who played with me, in Austin Powers, I'd like to beat that guy up because he can get shitloads of money for it, but we have to live with the shit that comes from it. And that's what most people don't know. Most people think, oh look, dwarfs are happy doing it, they've got a job, they're making money because what use are they to anybody else in society? But they don't see those social implications, that people have these things shouted at them, that people that are picked up and treated the same way. So I think that's more ethical to focus on that, on how we deal with that, rather than just go, it's a job for them. So the representation of a small person on Ricky Gervais's Life's Too Short leaves me in a conundrum. I worry that because Warwick is happy to get into a toilet because he thinks he's going to get £5 for it, doesn't necessarily mean that a dwarf on a night out who's made to do the same because would find it funny to participate in such behaviour. Okay, the offender may say it's, yeah. So the situation might not happen, but I've been in situations where I've control taken away from me because an average height person thought it was funny to lift me up and place me somewhere it'd be impossible for me to get down. So the knock-on effect of such antics does make you think twice before going to certain areas or doing certain things where you leave yourself vulnerable. So a lot of people with dwarfism are saying they know that when they see something like a film, television show where there's a dodgy representation, that's they're going to get the next day. Not the next day, they're going to get some point. So the evil toilet dwarf that Warwick sort of created was something that I know a guy was getting shouted at him as he was getting photographed. And I know, not long after he killed himself, because a lot of people with dwarfism, whilst we're seen as happy little creatures, a lot do, you're just human like anyone else, and a lot do take their own lives because they've had enough. But we don't see that, and we don't want to read it, and we don't want to listen to it, because it's too upsetting, or because it's just hilarious. Next. So, how do they cope with this then? Because the media isn't listening, the associations aren't doing anything. So one of the ways to deal with this abuse, because you are vulnerable, you've got average height people treating you like this, and yes, they do pick you up, is to avoid certain spaces. Okay, so I asked Jill and Steve, they were a married couple, so I did a paired interview. And as Steve says, I was going to the gym. It was a leisure centre and right next door to a comprehensive school. And the time that the gym class was finishing was the school's lunchtime. I was coming out of the gym as they were coming out of the school, and nothing directly at me, but I could hear the circus tune being whistled as they walked towards the car. And then as Joan interjects, Snow White sort of tune as well. And then Steve, I just didn't go back there. I didn't need to put myself in that position. And it was working, I was losing weight, but I stopped going, and I found another gym. Great, found another gym, but why should he have to find another gym? Why can't he go to that gym? And then as Naomi points out, I never want to be next to a poster advertising Snow White. I never want to be beneath the sign saying Snow White, because I never want to be that photo opportunity for someone with a camera phone. Because 90% you'll always get asked, you're happy or you're grumpy? Where's your 6 little friends? That kind of thing. Where's Snow White? And you're like, you're a grown man, why are you asking about fairy tales? And so, like I said, a lot of people with dwarfism get photographed. So if they're under that, perfect opportunity. So you avoid that because you avoid then being on Facebook in groups like I Hate Midgets, which apparently don't go against Facebook's community standards. So those are the kind of things, so you have to avoid it to kind of keep your own dignity, because you've lost that when the way that you're seen on telly. Okay? So to conclude, if you have to, the notion of space is important in understanding how people with dwarfism experience and navigate through the built environment. So both social and spatial elements of the built environment disable people with dwarfism. So it's not just the physicality of space, it's those social elements, it's the social attitudes. And those are very much influenced by cultural representations. So adopt numerous strategies that result in them negotiating space differently. So avoidance of certain areas, and this impacts the equality that they have. And cultural representations of dwarfism have a large impact on how they are treated, and these are influenced often by the meaning of spaces, so like theatres, nightclubs, that kind of thing. So the book recommends that it's important to create more accessible spaces for a wider range of disabled people, and recognise first and foremost that dwarfism is a disability. And understanding and representations of disability need to be more diverse, so instead of like Google, and you put into Google disability access, instead of looking at a load of images of a wheelchair user looking sad at a set of steps, why can't there be dwarfs in there? Why can't there be visually impaired people? It's just a whole range of disabled people. Let's not be so lazy, you know? And needs to change the problematic representations of dwarfism. So more diverse representations of people with dwarfism, so like, just playing everyday roles in films or whatever, if you want to give them jobs, whether they are just a teacher or whatever, a patient, a doctor, the real life roles, the real life occupations that we fulfill. And important to recognise that just because somebody has agreed to play the fool does not make that acceptable.